Architecture also has incredible applications in architecture. This is a termite mound in Africa. It could be -10 outside, it could be 40 outside, and a termite mound stays a constant about 32 degrees Celsius, independent. And they don't have an HVAC system. They don't have a bunch of termites running around shivering, right? It's passively ventilated and passively heated. So an architect named Mick Pierce sat down with some termite biologists and said, tell me how this works. What's the secret? And he built this building in Harare. Harare, Zimbabwe, pretty darn close to the equator. And it has no air conditioning. It stays 24 degrees Celsius all year round. The only thing it has is a couple of fans, which at night pull the cool air down. That's the blue at the bottom. And then during the day, that warm air rises and it pulls that cool air up through the building. 10%, 90% reduction in utilities. So at only the 10% of the cost from the utility perspective to run the building. Arup were the engineers that worked on that. Also in architecture, carpets. I talked about carpets before. This is an environmental nightmare, what we're standing on. Not only is it made out of oil, it's a one-time use. You can't clean it, without more toxins. Nylon 6,6 got all sorts of chemical nasties. So I've done a lot of work with Interface, which is one of the largest commercial carpet companies in the world. And we started by taking their designers out for a walk in the woods. We said, well, how would nature design a floor? What would it look like? And they were really inspired by the fact that a forest floor or a riverbed looks very different, even though things are all connected. So it looks continuous, but yet there's a lot of randomness. And so they took that design and they put it into modular carpet tiles. This one happens to be geometric in shape. Others have all different patterns, but what they found is that it significantly reduced waste in manufacturing because they could weave any color in, and scrap materials and different dye lots would all match. They don't glue it down. They actually just have little squares called tactiles that connect the things together. So you have a spill, you pull up one square, you put it in the dishwasher, it cleans, you put it back down. And so there's less waste in the installation. It's aesthetically more pleasing because it's not that, like make yourself dizzy walking down the hotel hall feeling. And they found huge, huge benefits merely by going for a walk in the woods. This is a polar bear. In Singapore, of all places, they were inspired by the polar bear. And the polar bear actually has hollow hairs. And when they stand up on end, it exposes the black skin. Polar bears have black skin underneath all that white hair. And they can thermoregulate based on whether or not they stand their hairs on end. Kind of like when we get goosebumps, our hair stands on end also. Well, the Singapore Art Center has these V-shaped louvers that they have photocells in them. And depending on where the sunlight is, they automatically respond to the sun and either let the heat in the building or shade the building from getting too hot. Merely by taking that inspiration from the changing perspective for a polar bear. This little guy is known as a water bear or a tardigrade. Way back in high school biology, you might have looked at a microscope through one of these. It, like the resurrection fern, can completely dry up and be like dead for 10, 15 years. And you add a drop of water and it will come back to life. It will literally come back to life. It's called anhydrobiosis, which means without water there is life, from the Latin. And what happens is this little critter, when it dries up, it kind of turns into an amber rather than sugar crystals. Its parts solidify rather than make crystals. When we dry up, our parts make crystals, and those crystals slice and dice our cells so that when you add water again, we leak and those cells die. All right? So this guy solidifies. It's a really interesting sugar in its system called trehalose that turns into that amber. Well, scientists have now been able to emulate the properties of trehalose to make vaccines that don't require a cold chain. So 50% of the vaccines we make today end up in the dump because somewhere along the line in getting from here to sub-Saharan Africa, they lose their refrigeration. And they end up having to be thrown away, and kids aren't getting vaccinated. And so this actually acts as a preservative that doesn't have mercury in it, doesn't have aluminum in it. It merely has trehalose in it that, upon exposure to water inside the bloodstream of the recipient, it rehydrates and disperses the vaccine. Couple other, it's called hydrous. A couple of other examples for the medical world. There's many, many, many. This is how viruses find human hosts. They actually are attracted to the charges on the surface of our cells. And by being attracted to those charges, that's how they find their way in and attack. This came about with the whole SARS scare. That was a virus, right? Remember, people were wearing masks around the world for quite a while. Well, this particular company built a mask in which they put that similar charge attractant on the mask surface so that viruses, which would otherwise make it right through the pores, stopped at the surface of the mask and no longer made their way into the mask. And then they put, I think, copper, little small particles of copper to then kill the virus that was on the surface. So BioFriend Biomask is the name of that. The company is Philogent. This last one is also really interesting. You've probably heard of the whole antibacterial resistant bugs that are creating a huge problem, the superbugs now, because we've used antibiotics so much that there are now bacteria that are no longer subject to them, no longer die. They're immune and have created an incredible amount of resistance, which is causing a lot of mortalities even in hospitals. So this one comes from Australia. A scientist was out swimming, scuba diving one day, and found this seaweed and noticed that the seaweed had no slimy feel to it. It had no biofilm growing on it. So started to dig in and try to understand what was going on. And it turns out, so biofilms are bacterial colonies that have decided to party together, right? And when they have a party, they produce a lot of sugar as waste. All right, kind of like us humans, actually. And that waste, that sugar waste, is what makes us sick from biofilms. It's not the bacteria so much as their leftovers that make the waste. So the way this seaweed works is it prevents the bacteria from getting together, prevents them from communicating. So when one bacteria lands, he can't say, hey guys, I found a great party spot, because their ears are plugged because of the chemical compound that this seaweed emits. And so when their ears are plugged, they can't harbor together, they can't have a party, they can't produce their biofilms. But nobody dies in the process. So because there's no killing off of the bacteria, there's no antibacterial resistance that's built up. So these furanones, scientists in the lab have synthesized 57 different kinds of furanones and are applying them topically, are embedding them in materials to prevent bacteria. It's a huge opportunity in medical applications in hospitals and so on. So the companies are Nova makes the vaccines, Philogent makes the mask, and Biosignal in Australia makes the furanones. So those are examples of nature as model, right? But we can also look to nature as measure, right? If 30 million other species are, and none of them are doing what we're doing, there might actually be a lesson in there, you know? As far as we know, we are the only species that drills 3,500 meters beneath the Earth's surface for our energy source, right? So if we're the only species that does that, maybe it's not the best idea, right? Maybe if none of the organisms in our history have ever done it. And of course, something like an explosion in the Gulf of Mexico is a good signal that's not a good idea. So measure says a way to judge the rightness, the appropriateness, the fittedness of our ideas.